It's a necessary recalibration. A strategic redistribution of assets for the greater good of the family legacy. The words, delivered with the practiced cadence of a seasoned orator, echoed in the sterile quiet of the lawyer's office. They weren't directed at me, not explicitly, but the air in the room thickened, pressing down, making my chest tight. My father, impeccably dressed in his usual charcoal suit, didn't even glance my way. His focus was entirely on Mr. Henderson, our family's longtime counsel, who offered a strained, almost imperceptible nod. The legacy he referred to, I knew, was a fragile, carefully constructed edifice of appearances, built on foundations I had painstakingly laid, brick by hard-won brick. My own small, carefully tended garden of achievement. My graduation was supposed to be a celebration, the culmination of years of quiet grit. I'd worked through college, juggling part-time jobs, student loans, and an unwavering commitment to my degree. I'd scraped by, living on instant noodles and sheer determination, all while maintaining a facade of normalcy for them. For my father, especially. He'd always been a man of pronouncements that subtly, insidiously, diminished my efforts. "Oh, that's nice, dear," he'd say, his tone laced with a familiar condescension, when I'd share an academic success. "You're very good at whatever it is you do." The implication always hung heavy. It was a hobby, a distraction, not real work, not something that truly mattered. My mother, bless her placid soul, existed in a perpetual state of agreement, a soft echo to his pronouncements. The house, a sprawling, meticulously maintained residence that spoke of wealth without warmth, was their kingdom. And I, the dutiful daughter, was a silent subject, expected to perform my role without complaint. There was the time, back in high school, when I'd poured months into a science fair project, a complex ecological model I was genuinely proud of. I'd stayed up late, painstakingly fabricating miniature ecosystems, calculating growth rates, and graphing my results. The week before the fair, my father had a vision. He declared he'd always wanted to enter a science fair, a childhood dream he'd apparently repressed. Within 48 hours, he'd borrowed my meticulously prepared display boards, my research notes, even a few of my carefully cultivated specimens. He'd slapped his name on the project, making minor, superficial changes, and presented it as his own. He won first prize. I remember standing in the gymnasium, watching him accept the blue ribbon, a forced smile plastered on his face, while I felt a cold knot of something that was definitely not pride settle in my stomach. My mother had just patted my arm. "He was so excited, dear," she'd whispered. "You understand, don't you?" I understood that my efforts were secondary, easily appropriated, and ultimately, invisible. Then there was the inheritance, a relatively small sum from a distant aunt. My father had been strangely insistent that I invest it in a family venture, a euphemism for a speculative, high-risk real estate deal he was dabbling in. I'd hesitated. I'd been saving that money, intending to use it for a down payment on my own small apartment, a symbol of independence I desperately craved. He'd cornered me in the study, surrounded by leather-bound books and the scent of old money. "It's for your future, darling," he'd purred, his eyes glinting. "We'll double it, triple it, and then you'll have more than enough. It's foolish to be sentimental about such small sums when such potential lies before us." He'd framed it as generosity, as fatherly wisdom. But I saw the calculation in his eyes, the implicit threat of disappointment if I dared to dissent. I'd capitulated, of course. The venture had, predictably, evaporated, taking my savings with it. The silence that followed that loss was deafening, a heavy shroud of regret and resentment I carried alone. The graduation ceremony was a blur of forced smiles and polite applause. I'd walked across the stage, accepted my diploma, a tangible representation of years of sacrifice, and then, the real work began. I'd secured a position at a prestigious firm, a direct result of my academic record and my internships. The offer letter was in my hand, a beacon of hope. But the ink was barely dry, the celebratory champagne still fizzy in the air, when the phone call came. It was Mr. Henderson. He sounded apologetic. He explained, in clipped, legalistic terms, that there had been a misinterpretation of my academic achievements. Apparently, my father had contacted him. He'd clarified that the degree was, in fact, a joint project, a family endeavor that he had significantly contributed to. He'd presented Mr. Henderson with what he called supporting documentation, a series of emails, heavily edited and selectively quoted, that painted a picture of his mentorship and guidance. He'd even produced a few handwritten notes, supposedly from my late nights studying, that were undeniably in his scrawl. My carefully curated transcript, the testament to my late nights and early mornings, was suddenly rendered collaborative. The offer was rescinded. Not outright, of course. A polite reconsideration, a change in departmental needs. But the message was clear. My future, carefully sculpted, was now subject to his renegotiation. I sat in my childhood bedroom, the floral wallpaper a mocking echo of innocence I no longer possessed. The diploma, still in its commemorative case, felt heavy, useless. The offer letter, crumpled in my hand, was a symbol of a stolen future. I replayed the conversation with Mr. Henderson. His hesitant tone, the way he'd avoided my gaze when he'd delivered the news. He was a man of contracts and clauses, of legalities and precedents. And my father, with his manufactured evidence and his silken lies, had manipulated the system. I felt a strange calm descend, a cold, clear space where panic had been. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a profound sense of detachment, of seeing the chess pieces laid out on a board I'd always assumed was my own. The next morning, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't call my mother and recount the injustice, knowing she'd offer only platitudes and misplaced sympathy. Instead, I went to the university library. I spent hours poring over academic policies, enrollment records, and the university's code of conduct. I requested my own unofficial transcripts, the ones with the professor's handwritten notes, the grading rubrics for my assignments, the records of my participation in study groups. I compiled a detailed timeline of my academic journey, cross-referencing every project, every exam, every significant interaction with my professors. I then meticulously documented every instance of my father's contributions, the borrowed project, the encouraging emails that were, in reality, critiques of my time management, the investment that disappeared. I photographed his handwriting on a grocery list and compared it to the notes he'd presented. The differences were subtle, but undeniable to a trained eye. I didn't confront my father. I didn't issue ultimatums. I simply compiled a meticulously organized dossier, a clinical exposé of his deception. I included copies of my offer letter, the rescinding email, and a detailed breakdown of my academic achievements, complete with supporting evidence from the university. I then wrote a brief, factual cover letter addressed to the CEO of the firm that had rescinded my offer. I stated, calmly and without emotion, that my application had been misrepresented and that I was providing documentation to clarify the situation. I attached my dossier. I also sent a copy, slightly redacted, to my father's most trusted business associate, a man known for his scrupulous integrity, along with a polite note expressing my concern about potential reputational damage due to artistic embellishments in academic pursuits. I did not ask for my job back. The desire for that particular validation had evaporated. My focus shifted. The fallout was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The phone calls started within days. First, my mother, her voice trembling, asking what I had done. Then, my father, his usual booming voice replaced by a strained, controlled fury. He demanded to know why I was embarrassing him, why I was destroying everything. He threatened legal action, disinheritance, all the usual arsenal of a man whose ego had been punctured. He sent his cronies, his golf buddies, his business acquaintances, to reason with me. They spoke of family loyalty, of understanding that fathers do things for their children. They didn't understand. They couldn't grasp the quiet, precise nature of what I had done. The CEO of the firm called me himself, his voice now respectful, tinged with something that sounded like apology. He reinstated my offer. But it was the quiet reaction from my father's associate that was truly satisfying. A single, terse text message, understood. The business venture my father had been so proud of, the one built on his legacy and connections, suddenly hit a series of bureaucratic snags. Permits were delayed. Investors grew wary. The carefully constructed edifice began to crumble, not with a bang, but with a slow, disheartening sigh. My father, stripped of his narrative, reduced to a man who had stolen his own daughter's credit, found himself ostracized. The social consequences were swift and brutal. His pronouncements lost their weight. His wisdom was exposed as manipulation. He became a cautionary tale, a pariah in the circles he had so carefully cultivated. I moved into my own apartment, a small, sunlit space that was entirely mine. I unpacked my books, my plants, and the diploma that now felt like a badge of honor, a symbol of resilience. I hadn't sought revenge. I had sought justice. A quiet, unyielding form of emotional and social retribution. The satisfaction wasn't in his downfall, but in the restoration of truth. The silence that followed was a balm, a deep, resonant peace. His calls stopped. The frantic texts from flying monkeys ceased. He was a ghost in my life, a forgotten chapter. And in the quiet space he left behind, I finally began to breathe.